Thank you very much for joining us for this special presentation, Drivers of the Biodiversity Crisis, America at a Crossroads. This is Rhode Island in focus. I'm Hawk Hammer. I work on communications and media relations for Defenders of Wildlife. As many of you know, we're witnessing extinction rates unprecedented in human history. 1 million species are threatened with extinction in the coming decades if we let the biodiversity crisis go unstopped. That problem is global, and no place in the United States is unaffected by those drivers of biodiversity crisis, which I will identify as habitat loss, pollution, overexploitation of species, invasive species, and the most harmful, climate change. You're going to hear those 5 frequently mentioned during this webinar. Rhode Island in focus here, and I will tell you I've been blown away in my research by the beauty of the state of Rhode Island and the unique species that call it home. As I told our panelists during prep for this, I'm really looking forward to going to visit and seeing some of these spectacles up close. Rufa red knots and the ever-cute and charismatic piping plovers walk the state's beaches, and you can also find hawksbill sea turtles and leatherback sea turtles off the coast. I would be remiss not to call out the American burying beetle for Dr. Lindsay Rosa, another species that calls the state of Rhode Island home. And of course, those are the imperiled species, those listed under the Endangered Species Act, but there are many other species not listed that coexist with Rhode Islanders. But that state, like all others, is feeling the effects of the biodiversity crisis. The situation is dire, but with bold policy, commitment to following the best available science, and a dedicated effort from all of us, we can combat the interconnected biodiversity and climate crisis. And we've got some of the best and brightest folks working to solve these issues here today on our panel to speak to their work. In other words, doom and gloom, but there is very, very, very much hope. I would like to thank our sponsor for this webinar, the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, and their partnership for our prior 2 webinars and our next ones as well. Thank you very much, National Caucus of Environmental Legislators. So, to the logistics side of things, folks, in the webinar, there is a chat where you can communicate with the hosts. We've got a team working behind the scenes if you're having technical difficulties at any time throughout this webinar. There's also going to be a Q&A session at the end of this. Please feel free to submit questions all throughout the webinar. We will try and get to all of them, and I'm really looking forward to this part of the presentation. We're going to try our best to get to all of them. If we don't, we will post a slide at the very end with the contact information for all of our panelists. We'll give you a chance to screenshot that. And then just for those thinking about it, I know as I always do when I'm in these things, if you're an attendee, you are muted and all your videos are going to be turned off. So to get things rolling, I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Lindsay Rosa, Defenders of Wildlife's Vice President of Conservation Research at Defenders of Wildlife. She leads our Center for Conservation Innovation, The center hosts an interdisciplinary team of scientists and policy analysts aiming at advancing policy-relevant research, filling critical gaps in scientific knowledge, and pioneering innovative, pragmatic conservation solutions. She serves as an affiliate faculty member in the Environmental Science and Policy Department at George Mason University and the University of Connecticut. Dr. Rosa earned her master's and PhD at the University of Connecticut, where she was born and raised, studying the impacts of climate change on invasive plant species success in forest ecosystems. Dr. Rosa, as always, it's a pleasure. I'm happy to turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you, Hawk. I appreciate those kind words. I'm going to see if I can advance my slides here. Perfect. All right. So Hawk said this in his wonderful intro, but I would make a guess that most folks on this call were familiar with this headline before he mentioned it. Globally, 1 million species are at risk of extinction in the coming decades, and we're experiencing a rate of biodiversity loss unprecedented in human history. In the US, 40% of our nation's plant and animal species are at the brink of extinction. And you can see some more of these scary stats for the US and North America here. I say scary because really so much of this is tied to the species, their interactions with each other and the rest of the world, our health and well-being, our economies and livelihoods. As our bee populations decline, for example, it's about more than walking through a field and no longer hearing the buzzing of bees. It's the decline in the native flowers that depend on them, the native local honey they produce and the crops they pollinate, the jobs and ecosystem services that rely on all of that and more. There's no common interest more widely shared among us than healthy natural systems and thriving biodiversity that serves at its foundation. So this big global headline here comes from a report that turns 5 years old this year, a global assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services that synthesizes a large body of science relevant for decision makers around the world. Other than being the landmark report to first identify this 1 million species at risk, it also highlights 5 main drivers of global biodiversity loss, which Hawk also kindly mentioned, as land and sea use change, invasive species, overexploitation, pollution, and climate change. So thanks to science, we know some of the challenges that our biodiversity is facing. However, there's still some key questions left unanswered, particularly here in the US, because we don't yet have the equivalent science assessment. There's a lot of great research that's being done. You'll hear about some of that today, but nothing that quite brings all of the pieces together to help us in understanding the impact here in the US at that national level. At Defenders of Wildlife, our Center for Conservation Innovation recognized the need to fill some of these knowledge gaps for a more comprehensive understanding of the threats to species in the US and the habitats they rely on. For that purpose, we developed and released a report based on some of the best available data for the lower 48 states. And of course, I want to give a shout out to the team that was behind all of this great work and the report, Dr. Laura Nunez and Talia Niederman in particular, for their hard effort and the strong science and analysis that they put into this. So we focused particularly on some of those species that are in greatest need of more immediate conservation efforts. And those were those species that are listed or as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act. So our team of scientists gathered available spatial information, data sets on the 5 main drivers of biodiversity loss in the lower 48. Each of these, of course, as you can see through these maps, having their own unique spatial patterns. And then they combine them for an overall look at essentially the threat risk and exposure. So here, areas in red have higher risk. And you can see that there are certainly concentrated pockets across the US in places like Florida and California, where we had our previous webinars, and there are some places in Rhode Island too. In fact, on average, Rhode Island and neighboring states in southern New England rank highly among the lower 48 in exposure risk to invasive species. So how do these areas compare with places where you can find many of our imperiled species that need conservation resources and attention? So here you can see that map that I just showed, but now instead you see it in these shades of mustard or yellow, if you will, compared with areas where we have very high biodiversity, a lot of these species where they overlap. So there's so the US certainly isn't exempt from the alarming global trends, again, as we noted. And nearly half of the areas across the US that really are the most biodiverse, where we find these hot spots of imperiled species, half of those also are at greatest exposure to these threats. So the large number and diversity of non-native species, invasive species that are found in areas of the US and certainly in Rhode Island and southern New England can have negative consequences for these imperiled native species and the habitats in the region. Where do we go from here? I think one theme that certainly underlies the 5 drivers of global biodiversity loss is that humans are the driving force. This also means that the steering wheel is in our hands. So we have the opportunity to take action to mitigate our impact and stem a crisis. The science is clear that we need to act now, and we have greater success when we do it together. We need strong conservation science and policy tools to tackle species extinction and the loss of nature and its benefits. Yes, we need a strong national commitment to tackling the biodiversity crisis, and a U.S. national biodiversity strategy would serve as a comprehensive blueprint for that policy action to stem the leading drivers of biodiversity loss and better coordinate efforts of federal departments and agencies across the government. And you can learn more about advocacy efforts on that here at 1millionspecies.org. But more important, conservation efforts are also happening locally, and lessons learned can and should be shared with people working across sectors and geographic scales. So we're here today to kick off continue what's been a series, a whirlwind tour of regions across the country, and to host these kind of important conversations, really, to identify some of the much needed innovative conservation solutions that are already underway or could be soon. I hope you join me in my excitement to hear more about what is happening here in Southern New England and Rhode Island specifically, and to help turn the tide on biodiversity loss. Excited to hear more about what these panelists are working on, not only, again, as Hawk put it, in that doom and gloom, but in really understanding where the hope lies, what's being done, what are the solutions that we can look to in the future for turning around this declining trend.
And certainly, as you discussed, Dr. Rosa, is science is what we need to be looking to inform some of those future solutions, not only from your department, but from our next panelist as well, who I'm very excited to introduce. Dr. Laura Meyerson is professor at the University of Rhode Island and has been since 2005 in the Department of Natural Resources Science. She is also the director of both the Restoration Ecology and Environmental Science minors. Dr. Meyerson is editor-in-chief of the journal Biological Invasions and an associate editor for the journal Neobiota. She was a contributing lead author for the recent IPBES report on invasive alien species. We reference that IPBES report quite a bit in everything we do here, Dr. Meyerson. Dr. Meyerson's research is global in nature and focuses on invasive species and ecological restoration with a particular emphasis on plants and their interactions, never to be overlooked, those plants. Sometimes I feel like they get to the back just because they don't have those fuzzy, cute faces. But Dr. Meyerson, very excited to hear the presentation on your work.
Hey, thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting me today. I'll jump right in. I'm going to talk a little bit about invasive species and their impacts today, and I'm going to start off at the global level. You know, we've already heard a bit from Lindsay and Hawk about why we care. Invasive species are one of the 5 major drivers of biodiversity loss and extinction. I'll talk a little bit about that. They impact every ecosystem on Earth. And those are data that came straight out of the IPBES report on invasive species that we published August 2023. And finally, they cost us a lot of money that could be going to other efforts, such as saving species from extinction or to education or all kinds of other things that we like. So they're a major problem. We know that we now have global evidence, and we have buy-in from countries all over the world that this is something new. Finally, there's a global recognition that this is a problem, and we have to do something about that. And that's actually really good news. That report, by the way, is available online for anybody that would like it. So the report is really comprehensive. We looked at more than 35 million records, more than 30,000 peer-reviewed papers. We held workshops with Indigenous and local communities, and we looked at work in 15 languages. Those aren't all the languages. We did miss some things, we know that, but this is the best that we've got so far. So, oops, sorry about that. So what we know is that we used collected records going back as far as 1500. Since that time, invasive species have been increasing in every region of the world. And when we break it down a little bit further, what we see is that that's true for all taxa. So across mammals, birds, insects, fish, you can see that over time, they're just increasing. Not surprisingly, we don't have data for things like algae and fungi until much later. People weren't quite looking, but you can see that in every region and for all these different taxa, they're going up. And unfortunately, the records show that of all 37% of all the known alien species have been reported since 1970, and that number is increasing. So things in the sense of the numbers of introductions of alien species are getting a bit worse. Everyone in the world is threatened by invasive species. All ecosystems are threatened. We have data to show that there are more than 37,000 established alien species in the world. It's probably much higher. We just don't have the data to show that. And we also show that 200 new alien species are being introduced around the world every year. We also were able to document that there are over 3,500 invasive species with negative impacts on nature and people. And you can see that the majority of these impacts come from introduced plants and invertebrates, with vertebrates and microbes also causing negative impacts to people and nature. And as we heard earlier from Hawk and Lindsay, also the magnitude of this threat is increasing because of climate change. A lot of invasive species are very plastic, and they're able to take advantage of the kinds of environmental changes that climate change brings. And we've seen some spectacular examples, for example, in Lahaina in Hawaii, where the fires were made much worse by invasive species. Here in Rhode Island, we have species like Phragmites, which I'll talk about, which are pose real fire threats, both to people and to nature. So invasive species impact nature negatively in a number of ways. They change ecosystems, through things like changing structure, changing temperature, changing light regimes, changing nutrient regimes. All of those things affect the species that live there. There are direct impacts, such as through predation and herbivory, and certainly also competition with native species for resources. There are other impacts as well, hybridization of native and invasive species, disease, parasitism, allelopathy, poisoning, toxicity, biofouling, certainly in our marine systems, and all kinds of other disturbances that are associated with invasive species. Protected areas are not protected from invasive species, unfortunately. We find a lot of invasives there, and it's impacting the species that live there. They're declining in their performance. The populations are getting smaller, and in some cases, we're getting extinctions. The data that we have on extinctions caused by invasive species are that vertebrates seem to be the biggest contributor to extinctions, followed by invertebrates, all kinds of insects, plants, and then microbes. Again, these are very conservative numbers. We just don't have data on this. And as we know, extinctions aren't usually sudden, they can be slow. So getting these data can be difficult. But invasive species are most definitely contributing to the biodiversity crisis. And here you can see that there are lots of different ways that invasive species do this. It's not just through predation, but also by changing ecosystems, by interfering with behavior and ability to get the resources that they need. All of these things are driving many of our native species into extinction. So here in New England, and particularly in Rhode Island, I'm sure you're all familiar with this species. It's invasive bittersweet. And you may have seen a lot of animals using it. Birds will use it, they'll eat it. But we know from studies, including from Scott McWilliams and his lab in my department, that the quality of the food for many of the fruits that come off invasive plants is not high. And it's the native species are not getting the nutrition that they need. And also they, of course, are then spreading it as they fly around and secrete or excrete the seeds. Other species like this one, the sacred lotus, is infesting some of our freshwater systems here in Rhode Island. This is one of my students in my restoration class trying to help clear sacred lotus from this pond in Cranston, Rhode Island. And it was really quite a spectacular day. And the students were quite good sports about all of this. And then, you know, there's the lanternfly. There's just another article in the New York Times, I believe it was yesterday, about the lanternfly and that we should still squish it. The reason I wanted to show this with the tree of heaven here on the left is that what we have here in Rhode Island and elsewhere is what we call an invasional meltdown, where two invasive species partner up and kind of make things worse. So Tree of Heaven is the host for the lanternfly in its native range. And here in New England, they have been reunited and they're wreaking havoc together. Phragmites is the plant that I've studied for the last 30 years. And I'm sure you're all familiar with it. You can't walk in Rhode Island without almost tripping over it. It has many ways to reproduce, you know, by seed, by stem, by rhizome. It's really quite a clever plant and spreads very readily. But there's good news. And this is a student of mine, Kim Dibble, and we did some work looking at how restoration affected native species here in Rhode Island. We know that Phragmites interrupts food webs and is poor quality. But the good news is that when we remove species like Phragmites, we can restore the habitat and we can restore the health of native species. So here in this graph, what you see is that there's really actually no difference between the restored marsh and the marsh that was never invaded in terms of mummy chalks. They're just as fecund. They have fewer parasites than the invaded site. And their growth is, I'm not showing that slide, but their growth is also equal. So the good news is that we do have invasions, but when we restore ecosystems, we can also restore the species that live there. And so that's something that's really wonderful. The same is true for arthropods. It was another study done by another group, Grattan and Deno, and they showed if you remove Phragmites, you get back your native assemblages of arthropods. So that's great news. That was my timer to tell me to hurry up. So last thing, we also know that Phragmites impede diamondback terrapin nesting. They can't get in there and dig their nest, and it's really quite a problem. Diamondback terrapins are state listed, but the good news is that we are restoring the ecosystems where they nest, and in many cases, such as at the Potawatomi Marsh, other species are benefiting, such as the salt marsh tiger beetle that David Gregg with the Rhode Island Natural History Survey found at the site, and also the salt marsh sparrow, as well as the diamondback terrapin. So that is good news. And there's just one ironic point I wanted to finish with. On the Connecticut River, where I did my dissertation research, there's a massive stand of Phragmites that has become really important habitat for migrating tree swallows. And every evening in the fall, you'll get about 500,000 birds coming into roost. So now this stand of invasive Phragmites that I studied as a grad student is protected for the tree swallows. And so that makes the story a little bit more complicated. And that's all I got. And I thank you for your attention.
Wow. The photo with the diamondback terrapin, sometimes you really have to think, like, you know, in the perspective of the species that you're working with to see that I guess were those roots that were covering up, or just the general plant itself?
Yeah, well, it's the rhizomes. They form very deep rhizome beds that the terrapins can't dig into. And then, of course, they have to get into all the stems above ground. So it's really just not good habitat.
Wow. Thank you very much, Dr. Meyerson, for that presentation. I'm very excited to introduce our next presenter, Dr. Tracy Rittenhouse. Dr. Rittenhouse is an associate professor at the University of Connecticut in the Department of Natural Resources and the Environment. Dr. Rittenhouse earned her Bachelor's of Science degree from the University of Wisconsin in 2000 and her master's degree in biological sciences from the University of Missouri in 2002. Her thesis was on the spotted salamander migration at a pond on a forest grassland edge. I feel like if that was a poem, I would also read that. We can circle back after this presentation. In 2007, she earned her doctorate on biological sciences from the University of Missouri with her dissertation on behavioral choice and demographic consequences of wood frog habitat selection in response to land use. Dr. Rittenhouse, very excited to hear your presentation, and thank you again for joining us today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Oh, let's make sure I got my slide. There we are. So I'm telling you, my message for today is that we're living the future. But I'll start by saying I'm a scientist. I'm a professor. I'm your typical professor. I have 50% teaching appointment, a 50% research appointment. And I have the pleasure of studying wildlife that live in our area. So I study bobcats and mallards and wood frogs. As you heard, my graduate work was all on amphibians. They are my comfort zone. And we're here today to talk about this biodiversity loss problem. It's a national problem. It's a global problem. It's a huge problem. It's a crisis, right? But I want to focus a little more close to home. When other people in the world or the nation think about our area, it's kind of considered the land between Boston and New York City. We are the land between Boston and New York City. It is many people think, like, do animals even live here? But those of us who live here know that we live in a very wild place with many wonderful species. But this context, where we live, it's an ex-urban forest. So what does that mean? It means that it's a unique place. You can fly over it in an airplane and you see continuous forest canopy. Right? It's forest. It's a forest ecosystem. It has trees and all the biodiversity that lives in it. If you drive across Rhode Island or Connecticut, what do you see? You see roads and houses. It's an urban place. It's home to millions of people, right? And so it's forest and it's urban at the same time. If you take any point in space and you drill down, it's forest canopy, and then you hit a house, it's urban. It's forest and urban at the same time. And that is really a unique situation, and it really influences the species that live here. So my first big point is to say that wildlife live in your neighborhood. These are all species that live in your neighborhood, and that's what I want to talk about today. So I did a big project on bobcats. We put out wildlife cameras all over the state, and we put stakes here so we could see who was living there. And the one thing we learned is that these urban places, these ex-urban forests, they change a lot. And so we thought we put them in forest, but it turns out the city decided to build a pave a trail in that area. And the construction crew was really nice. They left our stake in the exact same spot over that course of that 1 year. And what we learned is that both people and wildlife, including bobcats, use the same hiking trails. We had cameras all over the state. So we had cameras in wildlife areas, natural areas. We had cameras in a wide variety of neighborhoods. We have cameras in people's backyards. And what did we learn? There's a wide variety of species there. There are squirrels, there are deer, there are blue jays, coyotes, bobcats, bears, right? And sometimes they even enter your home. But if we take that point in space, that camera in a person's backyard, and we zoom out, what do we learn? Bears live in this neighborhood, right? And they might live here because there's this stream and this green space, right? And it just happens to walk through this person's yard. But will all these species live in a landscape that looks like this? And the answer is it really depends on the spatial scale. It really depends on the species that we're talking about, whether or not they can live in this type of landscape. But one of the things we're learning in our region here in Rhode Island and in Connecticut is that a lot more species live here than we thought were possible, right? Species that were once rare are now abundant. We need to celebrate our successes. We need to celebrate the successes of our wildlife managers. We've regrown forest, we've passed laws, we've enforced our wildlife laws, and we've protected wetlands and water. And so now we have examples of species that have increased in abundance and they now live in your neighborhood. So think about deer and turkey. These are species that were rare and are now common. I've had the pleasure of studying some of these species, and how do I mean, why do I know this to be true? And why do we know this as wildlife managers to be true? Here's a typical house. The wildlife managers came up, they walked up this driveway, they knocked on the door and said, "Excuse me, can we go on your property? We think there's a collared black bear on your property." And the landowner's like, "Sure, you can walk around my yard if you want, but there's no black bears that live here." And so the biologist walked down the driveway with the dog, you know, the owner's dog at his heels. They go down here and they stick a dart at the end of a jab stick and they walk right into this bush right here in the middle of the photograph and dart the black bear that's denned up in this bush. And this is her, E9. She's a black bear. She, you know, they took her out, they changed her collar, they put her back in the den, and she liked this spot. This is her home. This is where she lives. She liked it so much that she denned in this location 2 winters in a row, even though the neighbor's dog is running up and down the driveway every day. So wildlife live in your neighborhood, but can they live in all neighborhoods? Right, it really depends on the species. It depends on the spatial scale. We have collars out on bobcats, and we found that, you know, when I started the project, I thought they were very rare, pretty rare species. It turns out they're far more common than we thought, which is great. And they use resources that we thought they wouldn't use, right? So here's a female bobcat, and she denned in the shed in someone's backyard. This is where she lives. She moves around this landscape. She doesn't necessarily live in just the green space. She moves through the corridors of green space. She lives on the outer edge of the golf course. And so it's really about where animals live and the specific resources that any given species needs. We put solar powered transmitters on hen mallards. This is a species that's widely studied. We know a lot about it, or we did know a lot about it, but not in our area. And this is a species that needs water, right? And so we have this wetland, and when the locations, the GPS points on the hen clump, we could go and find the nest. We found the nest. It turns out that nest is in a courtyard. And so 4 of our hens nested in courtyards. And so how we design our buildings influence what wildlife species live in our neighborhoods. But we do need to make sure we're thinking about the fact that not all species will live in your yard. You have cottontails in your yards. Those are eastern cottontails. The species we're concerned about is the New England cottontail. This is the rare species. It will not live in your yard. It lives in shrublands and young forest. And young forest is not common in our area. To have young forest, we have to cut trees. And the hard thing about managing a species like this is that forest ages. Most of our trees are 70, 80, 100 years old. And so we have to cut trees so that we can have young forest. But young forest continues to grow. The trees grow and they age, and so it's no longer young forest. And so we need to make new young forest, right? And so over time, the young forest is in different locations across the landscape, and there's different amounts of it. And it's really important that we're focused on creating young forest And this is difficult to do, but our managers are really successful at managing species when we put time and money towards them. And even though our landscape is now full of houses, I should have more than one house, it's all houses, right? We're still working really hard and being reasonably successful at creating shrublands and young forests throughout our landscape. But this is hard work, right? That our wildlife managers are spending a lot of time and effort and money on. My third lesson is, species are abundant. They are wildlife. We have successes of increasing species. Our managers are successful at figuring out how to cause populations to increase. But what can you do? Participate in local government. This is super important and is something that we have been successful at here in our region. Both people and wildlife need clean water. And why do we have clean water? Because we have local planning and zoning committees, we have conservation commitments, we have wetland authorities. And these people who are working to make sure all of our neighborhoods are wonderful are doing a fairly decent job of keeping houses away from our wetlands. And this is vitally important for many species. Amphibians are my species that I love to work on. They breed in these vernal pools, they migrate into the forest. And so they need both water and forest. And an important thing to note is that a wood frog, even though it's very small, lives in the forest. They live in a 1 square meter area. So I put transmitters on frogs and we followed them from vernal pools out into the forest. And they live in a 1 square meter of forest for most of the year. 11 months of the year, you can find them in that same small space. But you cannot just go out there and plant 4 trees and think that a wood frog is going to be there, right? They don't see 4 trees as a tiny forest. They want a forest. You need 80 acres of forest to have wood frogs in it. And so we have lots of wood frogs in this region, and that's because we have a lot of forest. And that's important that we maintain that forest and we maintain our water resources. The other species I've talked about that really needs clean water and wetlands is mallards, right? The ducklings have to live in wetlands that have a lot of aquatic vegetation. We also have known for a long time, since this children's book came out in the 1940s, that mallards will live in urban places, right? And that people can help them get from their nesting sites to the duckling wetlands. But we're in a crisis because our common species are declining. Even mallards in our region are declining. And I was fortunate enough to get to study mallards because of this, but they're a game species, right? Therefore, there was money to put transmitters on the hen. And I was able to produce great information and share that information with the wildlife managers. And I'm very confident that our wildlife managers will take action and ensure that mallards remain a common species. But that leads me to my last point. And the last point is we have a lot of species that live in our backyards that we don't have information on. These are called state assessment priority species. You're going to hear about the state wildlife action plans that are under revision in Rhode Island and Connecticut right now. We have species of greatest conservation need. These are the species we know that are in decline or have some sort of threat that's affecting them. But then we have state assessment priority species. These are our bat species, our butterflies and moths, our water shrews. Right? These are species that we don't even have information or data on, or our data is 10 years old. I'm like, well, they were there 10 years ago. Are they still here now? These are the species that you should be concerned about. These are the species that you should know if they live in your neighborhood or not. And because we live in this beautiful place, this exurban forest, it's a place where people live. It includes both people and wildlife. And the cool thing about our region is that we have been living here for more than a decade. We've had exurban forest for multiple decades. And the question is, will we have exurban forest with lots of wildlife species for multiple generations?
Thank you very much, Dr. Rittenhouse. I was trying to come up with some cool segue, but you did it for me. Perfect lead into our next panelist. Amanda Freitas is the Rhode Island Wildlife Action Plan Community Liaison through a collaboration of the Rhode Island Natural History Survey and Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management. Here she helps diverse state and local interests, conservation partners, and residents alike implement the conservation actions in the 2015 Wildlife Action Plan. She also represents Rhode Island in many technical committees, but the one I want to flag, and the one that you flagged, Dr. Rittenhouse, is she is preparing to lead the impending 10-year plan update. As I mentioned, she serves on a number of committees, including the Northeast Fish and Wildlife Diversity Technical Committee, which works, excuse me, which works to identify and fund shared conservation priorities across 13 Northeast states and DC. She has a BA and MA in Environmental Science and Policy from Clark University and is proud to serve on the board of the Rhode Island Wild Plant Society. Amanda, turning it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So my title alone begs the question, what is a wildlife action plan? There is a pot of money from the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service called the State Wildlife Grants Program, and states need to undertake a full assessment of their native wildlife every 10 years to ID those that rise to the level of a species of greatest conservation need, identify their key habitats, and then how to conserve both. And as Dr. Rittenhouse alluded to, one of the reasons that this pot of money, even though it's not very big, is very important is because the rest of the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service funding sort of leaves reptiles, amphibians, and invertebrates, which is a huge part of the pie, out of the funding, out of the federal funding. And so this was a big deal when it came about in 2000. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see Rhode Island's current makeup of species of greatest conservation need. And you may notice that plants are conspicuously missing. Rhode Island did include them in 2015 in the Wildlife Action Plan, but in 2025, we are aiming to include them in a more meaningful way. And by more meaningful, I really mean to have more of them and to assign them their own threats and actions. And the reason that hadn't happened 10 years ago is because plants also aren't eligible for the state wildlife grants funding, whether they're in the plan or not. They have to have a nexus, a direct connection to an animal species that is. So, you know, the main reason we were invited here today, I think, was to talk about the 5 main drivers of global biodiversity loss. And so I thought it would be instructive to take those from the global level and the national level and sort of put them side by side with the overarching themes in the Rhode Island Wildlife Action Plan from 2015. And you can see that, you know, some of the language is different, but we're really looking at the same things, maybe in a little bit different order. But the themes are very much the same. And these themes on the right-hand side are taken from thousands of more specific threats tied to individual species of greatest conservation need and their key habitats, all of which have conservation actions assigned to them. And so what this really means is that state wildlife action plans are truly a blueprint for how to address at least a good chunk of the biodiversity crisis at the state and local level. With the recognition again that you know, we often tend to omit the things that the littlest among our life that really make the whole thing hum. And then at the Northeast level, the Northeast has rolled up its state wildlife action plans to identify regional species of greatest conservation need, or RSGCN, and priorities for those, including those that are best tackled at the regional scale. So we sort of have a two-pronged way to address threats in the Northeast. And so, you know, Rhode Island has over 450 species of greatest conservation need, and resources are limited. How do we move to action? It can be instructive to consider that really there are 2 major themes from my perspective that run through the Rhode Island Wildlife Action Plan, and I dare say through many of them. And the first one is what the Nature Conservancy often refers to as conserving the stage. And this is the idea that we really, we have to maintain enough diversity of intact habitats so species can move through and between them to find everything they need to thrive. And I'm gonna stick with their analogy and call the second one support your local actors. So this is really the vast majority of this is human behavior. And another way to kind of think about that is what are we doing in our built and natural landscapes that adds unnatural stressors to the species in them? And what changes can we make to be better stewards? So from the conserving the stage side of things, one of the most visible aspects of the Wildlife Action Plan is the conservation opportunity areas, or COA mapping. And this is a work in progress. It's not perfect, but it is a good start to identify proactive landscape scale priorities so that we can plan and act as opportunities arise, and we're not being just reactive about whether something is valuable to conserve or what we're going to do with it. There are three major elements to the conservation opportunity areas in Rhode Island, and the first one is core natural areas. And the largest of these often contain lands that were already conserved for documented values like rare and or diverse species assemblages. And so in addition to a lot of data about the vulnerabilities of area sensitive species, this also gives us, you know, a pretty good level of confidence that we're focusing in the right spots there. The second element is corridors, and these often follow riparian areas we know to be high value, high traffic areas for a lot of wildlife. But we really could use probably more data to fine tune other aspects of this layer, especially for poorly understood species that aren't captured well by bigger models. And so the third element is sites, and this is really a catch-all term for anything that was added for reasons other than size or connectivity. So among other things, it includes specialized habitat and natural areas that fall outside of the core natural areas. There are a bunch of other wildlife action plan products, and we hope to have more and better ones in 2025. But the one I want to most guide your attention to here is the one on the right, which shorthand called the community guide. And this guide speaks to various audiences, but again, as Dr. Rittenhouse pointed out, municipal planners are a big one. Municipalities are super important because in Rhode Island, they have home rule, which means that they have a big impact on how and where development occurs. So if safeguarding biodiversity makes it into municipal comprehensive plans, and thus into local zoning and other ordinances in a meaningful way, that is very powerful. If not, planning and siting can be reactionary, project by project, and folks who see a bad project coming into their neighborhood really don't have a whole lot of tools to do much about it. So I want to switch gears a little bit because I think it's important to highlight a couple examples of moving to action. This is all very high level and theoretical. And I chose pollinators to do so because Rhode Island has a lot of partners in this arena that really helped me end on a high note. Also, the story of pollinators, I think, really has everything. It's a mini version, at least, of restoring the stage. There's a focus on local actors. Pollinators are keystone species. Restoring native plants and insects really shores up the base of the food chain for all of the rest of us. And they're a galvanizing group of species. People like them, people want to see them, and people want to be able to help them. So on the research and survey side of things, the Division of Fish and Wildlife launched the Rhode Island Pollinator Atlas in 2021, trying to capture this enthusiasm for pollinators. And the Pollinator Atlas is really 3 mini projects that combine professional staff, trained volunteers, and a broader citizen science effort to gather information on these insects and their needs. And that involves some use of things like iNaturalist. The initial focus is on bees, but along the way, we're also capturing data on flower flies, as you can see from the top 2 photos, as well as wasps, butterflies, beetles, and moths. On the Rhode Island natural history side of things, the survey maintains Rhode Island's natural heritage database, as well as another database that holds more expansive records of the biota of Rhode Island, whether they are rare or not. And these repositories are critical to tracking biodiversity and identifying and sharing conservation priorities. The survey fills another important need, and that is of building and holding relationships. So in addition to the species data gathered through annual BioBlitzes, these events and many others help grow an extensive network for the sharing of information between scientists, practitioners, and the public. And a pollinator-themed example of that is in 2022, they saw a need and they hosted a bee research symposium that brought in researchers from across New England to discuss topics affecting pollinators, including things like pathogen spillover between managed and native pollinators. Moving to an example of management, you can see on the left here, this is Nicholas Farm Management Area in Coventry, where the state is maintaining a fire-adapted pitch pine barren, and this includes encouraging and propagating rare plants. The little cutie up in the top right there is frosted elfin butterfly, which is a state threatened species, and it's also due for a federal Fish and Wildlife listing decision in 2027. Here, this butterfly only has 2 host plants, the sundial lupin, which is also unfortunately a rare plant in Rhode Island, and yellow wild indigo. And we know that frosted elfin overwinter in loose cocoons. They just sort of drop from their host plants and tuck into that leaf litter. So we sort of, we know where they are in the fall and the winter. And that makes them an example that really goes beyond the maintaining the stage model where we need more information. Because it means we need to manage, we need to do prescribed burns and or other types of management that can mimic that in order to maintain the plants in that fire adapted habitat. But we also need to do it in a way that leaves enough of the butterflies that depend on those plants and on that habitat unharmed from year to year or treatment to treatment. We also know that elfin are now in only a handful of spots where those host plants are, the populations are big enough and healthy enough to support them. So, the big message here is that less redundancy in our systems as we lose species means that maintaining them becomes more and more complicated, recovering them becomes more and more complicated as we lose that redundancy. These are our critter kits. They were developed by the Division of Fish and Wildlife's outreach crew when basically demand for in-person programming far outstripped their ability to attend and put it on. These can be borrowed 2 weeks at a time. There are 3 physical copies of each kit throughout the state, plus those resources that can be available online are. And there's also support available for educators of all stripes who want to use these. The Pollinator Pals, excuse me, specifically includes information on Rhode Island's pollinators and conservation work using things like interactive activities, sample lesson plans, videos, and much more. And this is a busy slide, and I did that intentionally. It's really just to drive home the point that there are a lot of pollinator and pollinator adjacent initiatives in Rhode Island. Some partnerships are more official. Some folks are doing the good work of the Wildlife Action Plan, whether they know it or not. And all around here, because they have some participation in Rhode Island that lends me hope. And I just want to nod to 2. The Rhode Island Wild Plant Society's Reseeding Rhode Island initiative. This might be 4, actually. Like its Rhode Island Natural History Survey predecessor, Rhode Native, aims to preserve biodiversity of Rhode Island's native plant communities by increasing genetically native plants from locally native seed on the landscape, a need that's been identified at every level with increasing alarm. In a parallel effort, Rhode Island DOT, along with all of the other New England DOTs, via their New England Transportation Consortium and research partner UConn, have been working to tackle logistical challenges to naturalizing roadsides, including, most recently, looking at scaling up native seed sourcing. So we're working on that sort of at the micro level and the macro level and really trying to crack a big nut there. So to summarize, there's a lot of exciting stuff going on, and I would really just encourage folks to find what speaks to them and to become involved. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Amanda, for that detailed presentation. Very interesting and so much work. I know there's going to be a lot of effort into that the next plan that you're working on. Now turning to our last panelist, as we discuss science, as we discuss conservation, there is undoubtedly an inevitable relationship with politics. And I'm very excited to and appreciative for her time attending today to introduce Senator Dawn Oyer. Senator Oyer was elected to serve Newport and Jamestown in the Rhode Island Senate in 2017. She was appointed chair of the Senate Committee on Environment and Agriculture in 2021, and in 2023 was appointed chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Senator Oyer is deeply passionate about preserving and protecting our environment, promoting environmental justice, and creating a sustainable, climate-conscious economy. She was a lead sponsor of 2021's Historic Act on Climate, the most comprehensive climate legislation in Rhode Island history. among many other bills, Senator, where, just as we were starting this, the prep for this webinar today, you had this quote that just stood out to me, and I want you to repeat it if you would, before we launch into your presentation, because it just stood out and I loved it, and I'm might use it going forward. It's about the go ahead, because you said it so much better.
Oh yeah. So thank you for that introduction, and thanks for the invitation to be here, and to all of the sponsors and all the staff who put together today's webinar. It's not always easy to kind of wrangle everybody, so much appreciation for that. But the quote that he's mentioning, and I actually used this on a panel I spoke on a couple of weeks ago, related specifically to addressing climate issues. And what I said was, it's really important to me that we're following science over sound bites. And that's unfortunately not every elected official follows that, which is, I think, what leads to the political dialogue that we have in our country right now. But it really, really is so important. We have the science. We know what we need to do. We just need to have the political courage and the will to stand up and stand behind scientists and support that work and support those initiatives that we know are going to make a difference. So I'm really pleased to be on the panel today. And I also said before we started, I was like, I don't know, I feel like all of the scientists just need to talk. We don't need to learn about this this issue from politicians. But I'm really glad to be on with so many just fantastic experts in the field, and be able to just talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the policymaking world here in Rhode Island, and also a little bit, I think, about how everybody can pitch in their ways, both locally and globally. Because as was been mentioned, this isn't just a Rhode Island issue. We're focusing on Rhode Island, but this is a global issue, and we need action from everybody at every level of government, every level of policymaking. And I will tell you, from being an elected official, and I was an activist before I got elected, I still consider myself an organizer and an activist. We are a democratic republic. What that means is that we elect people to make those decisions, but that democracy piece doesn't start and it doesn't end on election day. That input that we get as elected officials influences the decisions that we make over the course of our legislative session on city and town councils. It influences their decisions that they're making when they're hearing from folks and they're not hearing from folks. That really impacts the outcome of votes. That impacts the outcomes of what policies move forward and what policies don't move forward, what initiatives get funded and what initiatives don't get funded. And I will tell you, I love that one of the earlier slides was talking about getting involved in local government and how so many of these decisions are made on the local level, because I feel like everyone's inclination is to focus on federal and national politics, and truly so many of those decisions are so local and so close to you at a level where really most folks are not engaged and most folks are not paying attention to. So one of the other things that I wanted to add to, I'm not even going to try to repeat any of the former comments that were made, aside from just making the point too that while these issues in Rhode Island are not unique to Rhode Island, there is an additional challenge with us being the smallest state while also being one of the most densely populated states. I think that does create additional challenges that are somewhat unique to Rhode Island. And then additionally, we have 39 cities and towns and various collective agreements between those 39 cities and towns. But really, there's challenges that come with that, and there's hesitation and a lot of times from the state to kind of come down to the local governments and tell them, what to do because of that local charter form of government that there is here in Rhode Island. But really, I wanted to highlight a few things that we've been working on at the State House. I know some of the previous panelists have talked about like the wildlife action plan that's going to be in the process of being updated. So looking forward to the public comment opportunity on that. We also passed the freshwater lake management program this last session. That was championed for a long time by Senator Sue Cisnowski. She's been working on freshwater issues, trying to address invasive species. One of the bills I'm proudest of, because a lot of times when you're working on legislation, you won't really you can come up with ideas, but to see an idea come from something that you're just thinking about to actually getting passed into law is really a fun experience. So there's this bill called Renewable Ready, and Senator DeMario, Chairwoman DeMario, carried that over the finish line. But really what that bill was about was an idea that I'd come up with a few years ago in this conversation about biodiversity. We know what those main drivers are for that biodiversity issue. And what we need to be cognizant of is that when we're trying to create policy that might affect one driving area, that we're not undermining in another area. And the solar, renewable energy, especially solar siting, has been prime example of what had started happening, and I think still is continuing, but I think it's being curbed a lot, is the clear cutting of forests to install solar panels. So we're dealing with the climate change issue by doing a deforestation issue. So that obviously not great. So there was some issues or some efforts to do, more comprehensive solar siting legislation a couple years ago. I think that restrictive approach is a piece of the puzzle. But the Renewable Ready bill is basically about identifying, sites that have already been disturbed. That would be ideal for solar. And then basically creating an incentive structure by way of shortcutting like the interconnection and things like that, doing that type of policy. So that way it's almost creating like pad ready sites and not creating additional habitat disturbance in other areas or other habitat loss. So trying to think through some of those things where we don't want to be, again, addressing one issue and then not considering the negative blowback. So that Renewable Ready bill was really fun to see that get across the finish line. And then we've also been trying to deal with the contaminants issue. So PFAS has been a huge topic of conversation that I think has only recently kind of hit the mainstream public awareness. I'm sure folks on this call have heard, known about it for decades, but it really, it's been interesting over the past couple of years of talking about that with some of my colleagues and how many really had never heard of it and didn't know what it was and didn't know what it meant. So being able to do a forever chemicals ban, so that's going to be phasing out the allowance of PFAS in products sold or manufactured in Rhode Island. And I think that's going to be really, really key. And then we also were able, on our green bond, we were able to restore some funding and add funding back into that was not originally included around open space funding. So I think that, there's definitely been a lot of work and a lot of focus trying to learn from the science and, address these issues from that science-based perspective. But the other thing that I want to say too is that really approaching all of these things with coalitions, and I love that last slide that she showed with all of the different initiatives that are happening around the state of Rhode Island, because really that people power and that coalition building is so key, not just in the success of the programs, because the more that people know about it and can spread that good word, but the more that people are invested in it, invested in the work that they're doing, and that does bleed up and bleed into that political process when we're talking about what programs are we funding, what programs are we supporting. And so, I think that really if anyone takes away, two things I'd like folks to take away from my remarks today is really that follow the science over sound bites, and people power and coalitions. Our democracy is not self-executing. We need folks involved at every level in any way that you can. Not showing up is a decision too, and that is going to be reflected. So we need folks to show up and we need folks to participate. I'm always happy to have a conversation with folks about the best way to do that, and help get people involved and engaged. But I know we're running short on time, so I want to basically close here and make sure that we have ample time to get to Q&A.
Thank you very much, Senator Oyer. And as she said, folks, this is one of my favorite parts of the webinar is time for Q&A. So if you had any questions, some of that information was so incredible and so thought-provoking, especially the temporal element that Dr. Rittenhouse was talking about with the New England cottontail, I believe it was. Pop them in the Q&A. We're going to try and get to as many as we can. But just to get us started, I get the first one. A huge question, super easy to answer, given everything. Dr. Rosa, I will go to you first. Given your expertise and experience, we hear a lot of these very scary numbers, very scary scope of the issue of the biodiversity and climate crisis. What do we got to do to reverse it? And do you think it's possible? And I'll throw that to Dr. Rosa first, and Dr. Meyerson, if I might put you on deck for that question as well. Dr. Rosa.
Yeah, I mean, if I had that answer for you, we might not be here today. Isn't that the case? I would say, I think one of the things to understand is there's going to be no silver bullet, right? We've been around already to Florida, to California, now to Rhode Island and Southern New England, and similar challenges, but for many of them, there may be different ways. We're talking about different species, different communities, different people, and different needs. So I think that a lot of the work that's being done, and Senator Oyer put it very nicely, talking about what's going on and understanding and focusing on the local level. I think that's important. I think the second piece to that's going to really help us in the long term is sharing that knowledge, what we're learning at these local levels, sharing that regionally, sharing it across regions, so that we can really build our toolkit and do it at a rate maybe a little bit more quickly than when we're kind of hoarding and that information and working and only thinking locally. So, I mean, those would be the two things, right? Trying to learn and stimulate thinking across scales and with different partners. And right, so some of that may only work at the local level, but some of it may help us really kind of progress in addressing biodiversity loss or some of these underlying drivers, I think, more broadly.
Dr. Meyerson, if I may, same question to you.
Sure. Thank you. I want to echo what Dr. Rosa said, and add that there is good news out there. I showed two examples of restoration, restoring species and ecosystems, but there are a lot of other things happening that are good. And every action that we take matters, as individuals, as groups. There's a lot that we can do. I'll give an example that I teach a restoration ecology course this fall. One thing that we're doing on campus is teaming up with the Lands and Browns folks. And we are working on a lot of native pollinator gardens that they have all over campus. And we're going to do species inventories and monitor who's used them. And the students are going to help control invasive species. And they're really going to see what's happening right there on campus in their own space. So it's really getting the sense of place and the difference that they can make by just caring for the habitats around them, even if they're small, even if they're only a few square meters, it can make a really big difference. So I would say, taking action in our own backyards is important, and also getting engaged with voting and politics and legislation, being aware, talking to people like Senator Oyer is really important. We need to have constant communication and really support each other. And the last thing I would say is that I think it's important that we begin to get the message out that our lives depend on biodiversity. I think people don't quite realize how dependent we are on all of the ecosystem services and benefits that we get from nature. And we need nature more than it needs us. And I think we all need to begin to recognize that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Meyerson. Ms. Freitas, can I throw that same question to you?
You can, and I hope you don't regret it. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I think it's super important to be active at the local level and at the national level, but I can't get past this idea that we really need to work on making our economy more in line with our ecology. And so working on towards a circular economy at all levels, because it feels like we, you know, the progress that everyone's talking about is so real and so wonderful, but it feels like there's always some kind of way that, you know, like we're reducing our fossil fuels for energy, but we're ramping up our plastics. And so, you know, these bigger conversations really need to happen, and we need to sort of figure out like what we're all concerned about, respect what everyone else is concerned about, and figure out a way to move forward together and sort of like through these roadblocks.
Senator Orr, since politics has been tapped in, one might say, same question to you. Is it possible to address this biodiversity crisis at the scale we're talking? You know, should we be giving up, or is there hope, and what needs to happen?
You know, it's interesting because I think that in the conversation, so raising awareness about the issue, and was said, making sure that, you know, that kind of, one of the sentiments that I hear sometimes when I talk about environment conservation, preservation, is that you care more about bunny rabbits than babies. And, you know, it's an interesting perspective, but it's funny because I'm like, well, we need the bunnies and the babies. And by the way, they breathe the same air and they drink the same water. And so, you know, the way of the honeybees so goes humanity. So this isn't about an either or. This is about the global urgency to solve this crisis. So I don't think it's a can we. I think it's we don't have a choice.
Absolutely. And I'm going to turn to a question from one of our attendees, and I'm going to add in my own as well. And I'm going to throw this one to Dr. Meyerson and Dr. Rittenhouse on this one. And so the question was, starting with, thank you so much for this wonderful and informative panel. I echo that. Given some of the age and power-based limitations facing children and adolescents when trying to engage in local initiatives and politics, what are some concrete examples of ways that youth can become involved in the efforts that have been discussed? And the context here is the attendee says, I'm a child adolescent climate psychologist. So I admit I'm asking a very pertinent question to her profession. So Dr. Rittenhouse, why don't we turn to you first with that question?
It's a big one, right? Most of the students that are in my classroom are very, they want action now. They very much understand the global biodiversity crisis. I've been teaching global sustainable natural resources for 13 years, and the students entering my classroom on the first day of this semester have changed drastically. You know, 13 years ago, people weren't really sure about these global problems. Every student, whether they're a business major, an art major, or a natural resources major, enters my class knowing we're in a biodiversity crisis. And I think that changed when the Great Barrier Reef had the big bleaching event, right? They all know that we're in a crisis. They want action now, and they want to take action now. So I think the thing that comes with wisdom is an age is understanding that things take time, changing systems take time. And any action that we take right now is going to take 5, 10, 15 years to play out and actually have an impact. And so I spend a lot of time talking about spatial patterns and temporal patterns in my classroom. So that's what they can learn. And then I think they will be global leaders, but the best place to start is to lead in your own local government. There are people in my town that have run for office, right? Not long off of high school or college, right? Like it's hard. You might not win, but you will learn a lot, and you will, you can have a lot of impact. You can create your own initiative. You can protect your own vernal pool, right there. Those experiences, you have to have experiences and skill sets that you develop as students. Once you have some skills or knowledge, right, then people will keep coming to you for more. But you have to start on a problem that you can tackle.
Dr. Marson, I'm going to throw the same question to you. And as an educator, with this restoration class, for example, that you're teaching, A, same question, but B, is there ever kind of an epiphany moment that you see in your students when what you're saying about restoration, what you're saying about the problem just really seems to sink in and into your students? And if you might describe that and then the question as well, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I'll answer the add-on first. Yes, I showed you that picture of the student in the pond up in Cranston pulling weeds. I had 30 students out there in waders, and they spent 5 hours in the pond getting wet and dirty, and they were just absolutely flabbergasted at what that invasion really entailed under the surface of the water. I mean, you can see it well from the walkway, but that was a big aha moment for them, really getting their hands dirty and understanding, that kind of what we call it is experiential learning, right? So really touching, feeling, all of that, I think brings those aha moments, and sort of gets back to the other part of the question, which is, what kind of activities can children get involved in? And I would say, first of all, just get dirty. Give them a little, hand lens, whatever, a little magnifying glass. You can get all kinds of interesting things. Some of our greatest naturalists, like E.O. Wilson, started out, just puttering around in their backyard, and looking at things, collecting bugs and ants and things. But also there are other groups. There's 4-H is fantastic, and that's available all over our state for students. And we work with the 4-H director in my department. She's wonderful, and that really gets young people out there. Also, I often will have teachers reach out and want to bring their classes to participate, and I welcome them on campus. We've had all kinds of K-12 students come into the lab, they come to the field, they get hands-on experience. They can do things like, help collect milkweed seed and then light it on fire to clean it, which they find very exciting. And so there are a lot of ways to really get people excited, and kids can make a big difference. I mean, they can actually get a lot done in an afternoon. So, I would say reach out, find people that, are willing to work with kids. Our college students love to work with K-12 students. There are a lot of opportunities out there, and yeah, encourage it. Great question. Thank you for that.
Fostering that appreciation for wildlife and nature is so critical and a big part of what I play. And certainly, a great start is when you're young, but it's never too late to better appreciate your outdoor spaces. And so that's going to lead us to our next question. And I think this is going to be, I'll ask Ms. Freitas, Dr. Rittenhouse, and Senator Oyer on this one. I'll start with Ms. Freitas. Rhode Island is a small state and has land and water contiguity with Connecticut and Massachusetts. In what ways are these, these 3 states and others cooperating in perhaps like state wildlife action plan efforts along the way to combat this biodiversity crisis? And are there challenges affiliated with that one? So, Ms. Freitas, I'll turn to you first.
I think there are always challenges, but we're small. So I have the benefit of, there's a larger organization nationwide, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And so I have the benefit of hearing kind of what's going on in other regions. And I realize over and over again that it is, they complain like, oh, sure, you guys coordinate because you're so small and you can, and we're huge. And, there's some truth to that. And so we are small. And we can coordinate, and a lot of times we do all know each other. There are organizations like the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program that span borders for water quality. I mentioned, or you might have mentioned, that I'm on the Diversity Technical Committee for the Northeast, so that's how we share information from Maine to Virginia, and then out to Pennsylvania and New York. So, well beyond just the tri-state area, to try to get on the same page about things. And the Diversity Technical Committee is not the only committee. There are committees for bear, for habitat, for all kinds of things. And so we coordinate in that way. Rhode Island doesn't have a lot of, we have trouble getting data. And so the Native Plant Trust, which is out of Massachusetts, is really their volunteer conservation corps, is really how we get most of our plant data and how that remains updated. So we're very grateful for that. And so there are just cadres of professional organizations and volunteers that are trying very hard to not reinvent the wheel, to share information, and to move forward with what's been shown to work in one spot or another. I'm more than happy to ride coattails when Connecticut and Massachusetts are out in front.
Dr. Rittenhouse, any additions to that?
Yeah, I don't have a specific example that's great other than the New England Cottontail regional monitoring effort, where the states are coming together to make sure that we're monitoring this rare species. I think that happens for lots of wildlife species out of necessity, being a small, the suite of small states. And so it is important to look for experts in our neighboring states. We're not going to have a species expert for every one of our species that's in the borders of our individual states, right? And wildlife don't see borders, so they cross borders all the time. And so I think we do have a lot of collaboration that happens. I don't have a perfect example to give off the top of my head.
Senator Oyer, certainly as you're legislating for Rhode Island, does the bigger, interconnected nature of some of these states and the proximity you have to them become involved in the work you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the sponsors of the event, NCEL, they are a great convening body. They just actually had their conference, which I unfortunately missed, but they just had their conference last weekend. And so, that's always a great opportunity for folks to get together. They host regular webinars. So through that, I've actually met a bunch of state legislators in Connecticut and Massachusetts. We often share ideas about, okay, what are you all working on in your state? Okay, let's take that. We need to, Rhode Islandize, the language or whatever. So there's definitely that, similar to Amanda's point, the sharing of ideas and also honestly kind of some of a support group too. It's always good to, get with people who are working on like-minded issues. And so yeah, I think there's a lot of collaboration. I know it's even on the climate space too, even from like a raw, data analysis perspective, there's been a lot of work to make sure that, we're not double counting stuff, we're not undercounting stuff when we're doing that greenhouse gas emissions. So I agree. I think we do have that benefit of being a small state in a close connected region.
Thank you very much, Senator Oyer. And Dr. Rose, with that, discussing that work between states, relationships across local, state, federal, tribal governments is very much a core aspect of the National Biodiversity Strategy. Am I correct there, or how would you describe that?
Yes, I would say so. I mean, it's something where, right, something like that is focused at the national level on a federal commitment, but really that's not, things don't need to happen top down here. I think that there's certainly the opportunity open, and there's so many of these states that are already working toward these policies and bills and finding the solutions. A biodiversity strategy is really just meant to essentially be the glue and to help kind of with a clear vision for that progress. You know, having a state biodiversity strategy is certainly something, or even a regional one in a case like New England, where a lot of the work is already being done and thought through at these across state borders. Certainly, I think another great opportunity for continuing to make progress on this.
And with just 5 minutes left in our webinar, though, I'll take the heat from my bosses if we go over a little bit. I usually save the last question for something that's really exciting, and really instills that, hey, let's get out there and let's combat this biodiversity crisis. But I'm gonna turn to the question from one of our attendees. And this is going to go to everybody. So Senator Oyer, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll just go around the virtual room. The writer is in residence for Creative Conserve, an arts and science animal conservation organization based in Rhode Island. The organization was Creature Conserve. One of our goals is to find creative ways to learn and share the science so that more people can be involved. As scientists, educators, and politicians, do you have thoughts? Well, and this is one for me I think about this every day, so I'm very excited about your answers. Do you have thoughts about how to keep the issues challenging each of us around the biodiversity crisis fresh, vital, and accessible? Big question. Yeah, the million, billion, trillion dollar question, I think truly. Senator Oyer, if I may start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the arts are critically important in that making that connection and making it real and making it, you know, fun and joyful as well. So I'm not sure that I have kind of like a specific overall, you know, a specific like idea for that aside from just making that point of the way that the art and science intersects to be able to make these opportunities be fulfilling and joyful. I will say that my mom was in town a couple weeks ago, and we took a seaweed pressing workshop from a local artist. And it was great because she harvests all the seaweed like locally. And so we made these prints out of local seaweed, the pressings, and then there's an element of it with the paper that changes with the sun printing paper. And it was just such a great experience. And the artist actually shared this history of seaweed art making in Rhode Island. And she actually had some artifacts that she had found on eBay of like folks used to do this in Victorian times where they would create artwork out of seaweed and send it as like cards to people. And so it was just this really beautiful opportunity that I got to be able to do with my mom. Really kind of brought it home, like that connection with the seaweed. We also just, you know, came out of the last session where we did the shoreline access bill that we're getting sued over. So, you know, that whole thing like just brought so many components together, and it was just such a wonderful experience to be able to participate in that, to be able to be with my mom and be able to share all of those Rhode Island connections with her. So I think continuing, and the arts community is great at this, about being able to come up with what's the new, you know, that new thing and the new way that we're going to interpret and translate this into the world. So I think the artists continuing to be artists is my answer to that.
Thank you very much. Dr. Rittenhouse, same question to you.
Right. It's very hard to keep the biodiversity crisis in the news because it happens slowly, and it takes scientists months to years to declare a species extinct. And so it just like doesn't happen, right? The artists who have to keep it front and center. You have a hard task. I think you have to find your local news stories, right? in the last year or two, we've had huge problems with turtles being illegally collected and shipped out of the US, right? And so there's been some cases where we've captured, where the law enforcement has stopped it from happening. Like that's successes that we stopped them from being illegally harvested or taken out of the US. There's local news stories like that. When we have these invasive species, the lanternfly, that there are neighborhoods in the region that are getting hit with lanternflies right now, but it happens to hit my neighborhood. I haven't experienced it yet. So that's really a breaking news stories that I need to hear about every day. So it's hard to find those stories, but they're super important. They're absolutely out there.
And for reference, one more time, as scientists, educators, and politicians, do you have thoughts about how to keep the issues challenging each of us fresh, vital, and accessible? Same question to you, Dr. Meyerson.
That's a great question. I point to the elephant installation in Newport. Everyone's excited about that. Everybody's going, tourists, local people. That's a great way to bring art and conservation together. There are other examples. I would say we should have more sort of poetry slam kinds of things. Those are things that young people could get involved in, have a chance to come in and do, some poetry or whatever they want to do to talk about what's happening. We can communicate in different ways. And then finally, there are a lot of great artists out there that are getting involved with projects happening at the state and local level. There's a woman named Stacy Levy. She's this wonderful artist that incorporates all kinds of interesting art into projects around the country. And, she really gives us something interesting to look at and learn about while we're making our roads and sidewalks and waterways better. So I think that artists have a lot to contribute, and it's incredibly important.
And last but not least, same question, Ms. Freitas.
There's a lot there. I feel like it's so as biologists, oftentimes we can be stuffy and have a tendency to want people to really understand that this is a big threat and do this about it. And we know there's social science piling up that says people don't want to hear that. They want solutions. They want it to be bite-sized. They want you to explain it in words they understand. And even to the point where people who understand about the biodiversity crisis might not be able to tell you what biodiversity means. They have a sense of it, but we need to talk to them in their own language. And I think I'm probably not telling the Creature Conserve folks anything they don't already know. They're the ones that are helping us kind of through this, the social scientists, the cross collaborations where, we're learning from you how to communicate what we know and creative ways to kind of draw connections so that people see them because, Senator Oyer mentioned people telling her that she was, making them choose between babies and bunnies. And I mean, that's, if people think that you're doing that, they're going to choose babies. They have to have this understanding, and we have to help them understand it without attacking them. And so I think, just help keep everyone seeing the beauty that all of this is, and finding ways to kind of draw it to what needs to be done.
And as we discuss communications and media relations, I got to also throw out on my end that I work with just a lot of really willing and open-minded reporters at the state, local, national levels that want to learn and understand and find these stories. So I really consider us fortunate on that front. I will never say no to more environmental coverage, however, as we kind of build this whole picture about appreciating nature, understanding what's happening around us at the state, local, tribal level, the national level, we got to build that appreciation there because there's a lot of big policy happening there. And we're certainly pushing for a national biodiversity strategy, but that is not the only policy out there. And so as we close, Dr. Rosa, I want to, the same kind of question, building that appreciation for nature, how do we bring it into that federal push?
Yeah, so I mean, I think a lot of folks here on this panel will agree that science is and science communications is also about storytelling. I think hopefully whoever the person who asked the question now has a lot of great ideas just from this 90-minute call and these last few minutes and answering their question. But right, being able to tell the story, right, we show the numbers and visuals on maps, help people, right, to find out more about the places where they live, right? That's I'm the map nerd. I appreciate that so much, and use that as a communication tool to let people interact with the information and find their own storyline. At the national level, you know, they're trying to also kind of do that, to fill in these information gaps for the US and do it in a way that will hopefully reach many different audiences for folks to be able to use this data. Underway right now is the development of our first ever US National Nature Assessment, which is right about advancing our knowledge, about hopefully informing and stimulating thinking on new policies, and about being able to start to connect back these stories to the people who can use the information and connect with it locally as well, and understand their areas and understand how it connects to other places in the US. So something to look out for, hopefully in the coming year or two, even more science that will give us more stories to tell.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rosa, and thank you everybody for sticking with us a few minutes past our scheduled time. We very much appreciate it, and we appreciate all your insights on this panel. Dr. Meyerson, Dr. Rittenhouse, Senator Oyer, Ms. Freitas, and Dr. Rosa, as always. There is no more important a time than now to be a friend of nature, to be an advocate for your outdoors, and to be a defender of wildlife. The biodiversity crisis is happening, and as we are learning, there's some really incredible minds in science, in the courts, in our state, local, tribal, and federal governments advocating for nature, and we're so grateful for that. Hopefully we got to some really interesting questions for folks, but if anything lingering or we didn't make it to your question, here is the slide. I'm going to give it just a moment for folks to take a quick screenshot with your phone. Our panelists are all very generous and have encouraged you to reach out with questions. If you have them, you know, education, understanding, and appreciation really comes from having good questions answered. And so take a screenshot of the slide up right now if you can, and we're gonna wrap it up once again with just a big round of applause. Big thank you to all our panelists for taking the time today. This was the third in our biodiversity, Drivers of the Biodiversity Crisis, America at a Crossroads webinar series. This one was Rhode Island in focus. Previously, we've done Florida, and we've also done California. Those can be found on our website, defenders.org. Specifically, if you want to visit defenders.org/biodiversity crossroads, it'll take you right there. And of course, stay tuned. The team here at Defenders of Wildlife is cooking up some future plans, and we're very excited to share those with you shortly. So that's going to do it for us today, folks. Thank you again, all the attendees and all of our panelists for taking the time. We very much appreciate it.